5. Go. Lights 5.5. Go. Lights, go. Lights, go. Lights, go. Lights, go.
Hello, and welcome to the masterclass Approaching Costume Design and Technology. I'm Jennifer Sheshko-Wood, professional costume designer, educator, and current director of costumes for the Utah Festival Opera and Musical Theater. Today I'll be bringing you through a sample costume design process, as well as introducing you to all the different roles that happen within the costume design and technology discipline. Today I'm going to talk to you about costume design and just the different steps it takes from the script to the stage. So the first thing that we do is that we read the script, we take the text, and we really delve into the words of it. Often we know who our directors are, but we might not have met them just yet once we get our script. So the first things that we do is read the text for a lot of layers of understanding, trying to figure out who these characters are and what your costumes will bring to the table when designing for them. So we really read the play for first impressions. We try to figure out what the goal is of the production and how can we reinforce that storytelling with the costumes. Before you even meet with a director, you can start looking at the text to find these clues. And so I'm going to guide you to a set of paperworks called Script Notations and Action Plots. So these are two pieces of paperwork that come from costume design. Other design disciplines might do them, but they're really text-based, so you can do them at any point early on in your design process. So looking down here at this sample of script notations, this is when you go through the text and you really highlight everything that can pertain to not just costume, but to characters' state of mind, to their story arc, references to times of day, changes of time, weather, elements like that. So to give you an example, I've pulled up my You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown paperwork. We'll be using a little bit of this show and a little bit of Magic Flute from Utah Festival Opera as a way to kind of act as case studies as we go through this design process. So with the script notations, right now I have it organized by page, by character, and by the notes themselves. And so when you're working, that way you can easily access the information as you share it with your director or other parts of the design team. And you note down who the character they're talking about, and if they say it about themselves or if someone else says it about them. So what's important to note with script notations is that knowing the context of the words is important. Does the character talk about themselves? Does it come from another character? Or does it come from the stage directions? And are those stage directions original text from the playwright? Or are they more about the original blocking from that past production or that first production? So as you can see here, an example on page 5 where Sally says, "The only thing wrong with my big brother Charlie Brown is his lack of confidence, his inferiority and his lack of confidence. His clumsiness, his inferiority and his lack of confidence. His stupidity, his clumsiness, his inferiority and his lack of confidence. And then she gets cut off by her brother." And so this idea of looking at Sally's perspective of Charlie and how they might view each other. And part of the costume designer's job is to look at the words of the text and to see who's saying what about whom, and if we can trust that. Often we're our own worst critics, and so looking at the words, but also taking a step back to see how do you view that character, and does it gel with what's being said in the script? So going through the text, you note down everything that could impact costumes. I will look for things about props, if they put things into pockets, if they carry things around, do they need accessories like purses or backpacks or things to put those props into? Does it reference a passage of time? And so that might indicate that they need more than one costume if this play takes place over a series of days. In the case of Charlie Brown, there were a few changes, specifically because they have nighttime and pajama looks. And then we also played with this idea of an opening concept where they weren't necessarily looking three-dimensional, and we were playing with this idea of two-dimensional beings. So looking at the script, you can break down basically to see how many costumes they might need. And that's all based on the text. It's not based on budget yet. It's not based on concept. That comes later on. So along with those script notations where you really break down the text, there's another version of paperwork that helps you track the action, and this is called the action plot. So action plot, action chart, depending on who teaches you, this idea is that you are charting the entrances and exits of every character and every actor that comes on stage. So like you can see here, in this version from Charlie Brown, is that I have my cast, so I knew who they were, and then I have their characters, and it's broken down by act, by scene, and by song, and by page, and by the spread of that page. So I could see how long a scene is, or how long someone might have if they're off stage or on stage. And oftentimes with musicals, it's easier to know the scene you're in by the song or by the music. So for action plots for musicals, I'll always add in the most, not important, but the most recognizable song from that scene if there's more than one song in it. So example, with Act 1, Scene 1, then we have everyone starting on stage because they started on stage and then they were lit individually. So part of the text says that everyone just starts on stage, so I have that noted down there. And then everyone stays on stage through scene 2. And so exit means exit, X means exit, and E means enter. And so that way I'm able to see which characters are on the stage at which point. And that also helps me break down, depending on if we know that people are going to have a change of costume, this can really lay out the action for you to figure out how much time do you actually have to do the things that you're hoping to do with the design. So as a preliminary piece of paperwork, this is purely done through the text. I'm not yet factoring in if the director likes to use actors for scene changes and has them come on stage else times than how they're referenced in the text. So along with analyzing your text and getting excited about the play, our next job as costumers is to put a visual on it, is to figure out how we want to clothe these characters and what impact we want to have. So depending on the play or the musical, you have to kind of do a number of levels of research. One thing we'll talk about in a little bit while, and I'll show you that through Magic Flute, is the idea of evocative research. How are you able to sell the emotion or the themes of the piece in research that isn't necessarily historical or realistic or literal? And it takes a symbolic symbolic meaning on. Because if you can hit the intent of the character and the heart of a character with research that really elicits a reaction from your director, it could really help pull the audience in as you're trying to define and design that character. For Charlie Brown, we knew that we would use the cartoon, the Peanuts cartoon, as a lot of source material. So my research started with Peanuts and with what those characters were. What was their iconic look? How can I make them recognizable to the audience? And so I started by pulling some of that cartoon research. So seen here. In this case, I worked in a Word document. More often than not, I'll do a PowerPoint so that I can share that PDF with the director and really curate the type of research that I guide them through. But really, this opening part of research is about gathering data. It's about finding as much as you can. So then that way, as you walk into the design process and the concept starts to flesh out with the design team and the director, you can slough away some of those images that might not be helpful anymore. But really this opening part is about inspiration and finding things that really excite you about the text and the time period and the content of the show. So for Peanuts, I wanted to identify all the different characters because it'd actually been a while since I'd read the cartoons and I had to refamiliarize myself with them. And so looking up again and figuring out and breaking down the iconic details of Charlie, of Lucy, of Sally, of Linus, of Schroeder, and of Snoopy. And also trying to look at who these characters were so that I can transform an actor into that character. And then also putting some questions down for myself, some ideas, some thoughts, some directionality to pitch or to bring to the director. I didn't know yet if the director was interested in having Snoopy look like a dog or look like a human that was Snoopy-esque, right? So what are some different ways that I could approach this character? And so I made some notes to myself as ways to kind of ask questions when I met with the director for the first time. So more research on the different characters. They weren't always drawn the same way, right? Charlie Brown was pretty iconic with his yellow zigzag shirt, but Lucy and Linus and Patty and Sally and everyone, they might have had a variety of looks. So I researched what their main look could be if I wanted to base anything on that, but then also what other types of silhouettes could they have had in the cartoon series. And so exploring different color palettes, exploring different silhouettes for each character. And so juxtaposing in this image, it's the same exact drawing, but they've been colored differently and given different types of patterns. Identifying the gang as characters, but then also how they started. I didn't actually realize that the vintage Charlie Brown had a whole different look than the iconic look that I eventually learned in my own childhood. So every costume design is an excuse to research something and learn something new about that period, that content, that idea. It's always nice to dig a little bit deeper so that you can inform yourself on more than just the surface level aesthetic of the design. So that being said, we knew we probably weren't going to do cartoon characters. This design was probably going to end up being a little bit more realistic. And so the next step was working with the director and talking with the director, Stefan Espinosa, about how we wanted to approach these characters. And so we ended up having an individual meeting where we just talked costumes. And depending on the design team that you're a part of, you might have individual meetings with your director and then come together as a team. You all might start as one group together in a room. A lot of professional designing, you don't always have the luxury of working in a room together and just talking, so you do have to bring things to the table pretty quickly. But just know that the design process is really dependent on the people in that room and how they go about doing it. And some directors might want you to bring a lot of ideas really fast, and some might want to just sit and talk ideas and then develop the concept together. So part of design is reading the room and learning how you can best support that team. So in this case, Stefan and I had some conversations, and we were really interested in the idea of making these characters as human as possible, even if they were based on two-dimensional cartoons. And working with this idea of the set being inspired by comic strips, and then the color being filled in with lighting and with costume as they all filled the space. And so this developed this idea that we were going to have all the characters in two-dimensional looking paper doll outfits, and then they could remove those and come in full color and explode into the stage in the opening number, and really bring the audience from a black and white world into a world full of youthfulness and color. So that being said, my challenge was about taking the silhouette and the playfulness and the childlikeness of the Peanuts cartoon, but transitioning it into real-life clothing. And this is a term you might hear sometimes, costumes versus clothing. And costumes have an element, even though all theatrical plays are costumes, depending on, as you talk to your director, sometimes there's an element of realism, and we want the people on stage to look like they are wearing real clothes, things that you can live in, things that the audience can recognize. Whereas sometimes the production is more about fantastical, over-the-top, spectacle-based costumes that are meant to sell a certain type of look. And we'll explore that idea a little bit further when we take a pause to dip into the magic flute. Whereas Charlie Brown was really about making recognizable silhouettes on stage that the audience could relate to. So that led me to my next layer of research. So looking at kids' fashion and seeing what kind of palettes and colors and patterns and silhouettes were prevalent and popular in kids' fashion in 2018 and a little bit before. So looking at long shorts, at tunic dresses, leggings, things like that, things that layer together to make this youthful appearance. And kind of self-informing on what is kids' fashion today. It's really easy with clothing to kind of assume that what you know about a certain era or modern era is what it is, but how do you research a larger scope? How do you look across a different country or a different area of the country and really try to define somebody with fashion? So in Charlie Brown, we were playing with color and with silhouette more than anything else. So like you can see here in the images, there's some similarities to how the shorts would all hit the kids at a certain point below their knee, where they would have leggings or where the waist of dresses would hit. So I'm really looking at the silhouette of these costumes to try to create these young silhouettes. And what is this use of pattern? And what is the mix of pattern to kind of give that chaos that could sometimes be a part of being a child? And then the idea that the reality of our show was that we were going to have adults playing kids. And so then how do I take this silhouette of a child and apply it to somebody who's 5'4", 5'6", 6'3", depending on the performer, and really play with their body proportions to still sell this idea of youthfulness? Luckily, I had phenomenal actors who could embody that playfulness and childlike wonder, and they would do that. But my costumes could support them in a way if I could make sure that the cut and the silhouette and the fit could feel more childlike than adult. And usually I'm not saying it's about bagginess, but it's about making sure that the costumes fit in a way that doesn't look like a well-dressed adult. It looks more like a kid would use it. So transitioning these silhouettes from the children's fashion into more adult-looking things. And at this point now, I'm further along in my design process, so I am making choices based on specific characters. I've talked with my director, I've shown them this research, and we've really kind of fleshed out what are the specific things that we would like for these characters. But now we've also established how many costumes we're going to use, because by now we know budgets, and we can make sure that I'm not designing something that is too big for the budgets that will allow us to do. And so we know that we will have a set of costumes as their main look. We are not changing costumes for every single day that's shown in the play. We're not really embracing that element of reality. They're going to have all that same look, and they'll add a piece here, they'll change a piece out there, they'll wear pajamas for one specific moment later on in the production, or they'll put a bathrobe over top to hide their costume. But we've made these decisions to kind of help clarify the direction and the action of the play. So I'm making decisions on the character of Schroeder, on Linus, on Lucy, and how do I make Lucy and Sally different, even though they may have similar looking silhouettes. And so in this case, I made choices about fabric stiffness and poof, and the movement that fabrics would do on their different bodies. So Sally would get something that's a little bit more playful and a little bit more swishy. And by then we've decided also that Snoopy is going to be a human-looking person that has elements of Snoopy about him. We were not going to try to make a dog-like costume for him. So everyone is playing in this idea of a childlike silhouette, but transformed onto an adult body. Now we'll take a pause to talk a little bit more about research. Obviously, I hope I'm giving the theme that I do a lot of research for shows, and it's something that I really get excited about. Sometimes chasing imagery through books or through text or through Google searches, just be mindful of the websites you visit. It's a really nice way to flesh out and understand a time period or a design. So for Charlie Brown, I was looking more at modern fashion and working with the director to find real clothing for these characters. But I want to fast forward us 2 years to summer 2020, where we would have produced The Magic Flute with director Vanessa Ballum. And this was a production where it is an opera that is very fantastical. It has a very strong protagonist and antagonist, but you kind of learn maybe they're not quite who you think they are. And there's elements of magic and elements of love and treachery in it. And so we were really interested in playing with this idea of heightening the drama. It is opera, right? So you get to play with spectacle. So this is a show where we really wanted to work with making costumes that really made statements. So then that way, as characters came out and then how they were lit and how they entered the space would really make an impact on the audience. The music of Magic Flute is drama. And so using the music as inspiration to really heighten the drama of the costumes. So part of that show was about researching the time periods and learning more about them myself. As a costume designer, I have a lot of knowledge on a lot of periods, but unless I've designed a show in that era, I am not a historian. I am not someone who knows everything about every era. So I do a lot of research so that I can inform and learn more about that period. And so we knew that we wanted to set this in early Egyptian and early Asian dynasties. And I have an idea of what that silhouette is like, but I really wanted to make sure that I knew the terminology of those time periods and those cultures, and to know how they treated clothing. And so I created a database of research so that way I could learn more about what each character could wear and how color and duality between these characters that fight throughout the story could enforce that story. So in working on the Magic Flute, I knew that we had a specific time period that I could pull different looks from. We weren't trying to set it in a specific exact year. We were looking more at the silhouette and feeling of those time periods. But that I had the luxury of doing modern interpretations with fabric and textiles and fabric treatments and color, and using, not necessarily being restricted or accurate to the fabrics of that time period. And then really playing with the duality of color between the Queen of the Night and Sarastro, who he calls himself the sun god. So really juxtaposing their people and them as Sarastro and the people of the sun, very light and glittery of folks. And then the Queen of the Night and her people as being darker tones, smokier tones, and how can we have those colors collide on stage? And then within that color palette is really playing with hard and soft textures. I'm a fan of tactility in a design, and so working with kind of the armor-like structure of leather, and how does that work when paired with like this sheer floatiness of chiffon, either between different characters or within the same person, right? How can we show the facets of a character by playing not just with color and pattern, but also the texture and layers of their fabric? So for me, researching those time periods, really looking into what the Egyptians wore, what their silhouettes were like, what their hems were like, depending on the gender and social class of each of the characters. And because I've already read the script and done my paperwork that helps me break down the text, I'm able to start making clear choices kind of on who these characters are, and making offers to Vanessa, the director, of Tamino and Pamina and these characters and how they might fit into this research. And so as I'm working is informing myself on terminology, on looking at what the timeline of how fashion shifted within these different cultures, but also expanding my idea of what makes up these cultures and how their fashion could feed my design. Because Vanessa and I were interested in playing with tactility and playing with kind of amping up the drama with each of these characters, I looked into non-fabric based tactilities and different techniques that we could use in clothing that might not have been done necessarily in the time periods. And so gravitating towards paper crafts and origami and different types of artistry that would have been prevalent in those time periods, and infusing that idea of facetedness into the design. So I started to also research what are potential fabric treatments that we could do to these costumes to add more texture and layer to them. The Utah Festival Opera operates out of the Ellen Eccles Theater in Logan, and it's a large stage. It's a big throw distance between the audience and the front of that apron, because you are watching the stage over the orchestra pit in areas. And so it's a long distance, and so how can we make the costumes legible and impactful for the person in the front row, as well as the person at the very back of the balcony? And I find that things that allow for a little bit of light and shadow to play into the costume, things that give texture and rigidity, can really show a little bit more impact. So before I was playing with this idea of folding and how to manipulate stiffer fabrics, but what happens if we do these same kind of architectural techniques on regular fabric? So I started researching what are things that I could already purchase in a way to give this sense of movement and texture, or what are some things that the costume studio could do to really manipulate fabric in order to play with it. So for this still to me counted almost like as evocative research, because I was finding tactile and visual ways to show that texture that I was interested in, that we played with pulling into the design. So even though it's very functional and it's a historical or a fashion-based thing, it still gave Vanessa and I a lot of kind of meat to grab into as we were talking about these characters. The same idea of playing with interesting fabrics. What are fabrics that already exist out there that I could purchase to build these garments with? What are things that I could be on the lookout for as I'm pulling from stock or shopping online? And so not necessarily always having to make it yourself, but how can you combine found objects to still give you that sense of kind of homemade texture and layering? And then pulling it back a little bit more into the historical research, but now bridging it into modern interpretations. Because we weren't necessarily looking to set our opera in that historical time period, but I was still interested in seeing how other people from those cultures had taken historical dress and modernized it. I did a segment of research on that exact thing. So what is the fabric? What is the pattern? What's the drape? What is the flow and layering of these costume or garment pieces? And now that I've found imagery that I like, that talks on a more kind of design level and a more evocative level, I'm now making decisions on specific things for characters. By this point in Magic Flute, I have already started doing some rendering, some rough sketches, ways to get ideas out of my head and onto paper. But now I'm finding images that can really correlate to work for a character. So this is an example of Papageno, who is kind of a clownish character in the play or in the opera, and what his silhouette could be, but also how do we modernize it? His character is a bird catcher, so there's usually elements of feathers or that kind of texture on him. And so what is the silhouette that I'd be bringing, hopefully freshly, to this character? For Queen of the Night, that idea of amplifying drama with her costume, she has one of the most notorious arias in the piece. And how do we use volume and texture and the movement of costume to help amplify her already intense experience? She has three ladies who help her, who do her bidding and kind of interact with the other characters. And I was interested in playing with a modern silhouette that gave them a little bit more of a masculine appearance. So then that way they had this element of long-leggedness, but also softness that they could use as they are three spirits that kind of come and go and fluctuate around the Queen of the Night. How could those sheer, light, floaty layers kind of float together and make them appear as more than a single person? So Vanessa and I conceptualized with the idea that maybe they are a group that can kind of ebb and flow in silhouette. Their silhouettes ever join up with lighting, and then they can separate back into three people. And so creating sheer layers that can kind of trick the audience's eye into thinking who's a part of which costume piece, if that makes sense. So for these three ladies is playing with texture and silhouette, but also opacity of how their costumes interact on their bodies and between each other. Pamina, as the daughter of Queen of the Night, has elements of her mother, but also a lot of softness and vulnerability to her. So how to show that within her costume, and thinking of how fabric moves on a body, and how, depending on her actions and movements throughout the space, how do we show that sense of floatiness and lightness? And I'm a sucker for chiffon, if I'm not the one hemming it. So any chance to kind of put that on stage, I'll take it. And then also researching the idea of historic armor, but what's a modern interpretation of it, of how we can play with these characters. Because there's a lot of hardness in Sarostro's men and Sarostro's guards, especially when they are kind of the enforcers of the opera. And so looking at what's the historical silhouette, but then how can I modernize it so that it becomes into the world of our play? So I hope that that little button of evocative research was helpful, because some productions want this span of research and some productions want you to focus in on the clothing or on the reality of the piece, right? But really it comes down to what is the intent of the production, what is the design team hoping to achieve, and how can you support that with your costumes, and always making sure that you are working within the world that the design team is creating. So now that you have your research and you've talked with your director and you're starting your paperwork, throughout this entire process, you might have been sketching or finding images that can help you really exemplify the costumes. These days, I render on an iPad in a program called Procreate, partially just because I like being able to always have my supplies on me, and I'm getting spoiled by working with digital media, but as an added tool to your toolbox. So when you're rendering, you have any option of things to draw with, but the important thing to know is that renderings are a communication tool. They're how you show the director what's inside your head. And if rendering isn't your forte yet, then research or collages and clear conversation can also sell that as well. But the important thing to remember is that these drawings are just ways to communicate your intent to the costume studio. And so in a second, I'll bring you through a few of my sketches when it comes to working in Procreate. But it's the same thing as working in paper and pencil. You can just zoom in a little bit easier and it's faster to erase. And I like the fact that I can render something and get rid of layers as I go. So then that way I can either have a very kind of clean and pristine rendering, or I can keep all those layers and let those layers build up so it becomes a very sketchy and kind of messy but fun, chaotic style. So as someone who likes to vary their rendering style, I find that doing it digitally can help me do that. And also, because I keep everything on separate layers, Procreate is similar to Photoshop, for those of you who are familiar, is that you build in layers in the digital program, is that I can, if I keep everything in separate layers, I can swap something out really quickly. Or if I'm trying to decide between different color palettes or pattern, I can draw them both ways, turn off that layer, and see what the dress looks like blue, and then I can turn it off and see what that dress looks like green, and really play with how I'd like to grow that design. But it's the same techniques that you would utilize with traditional media. And so I would encourage people who are interested in drawing digitally is to keep drawing with paper as well. So then that way you don't lose that comfort with working with paper and pencil or paper and paint. For this sample rough sketch from Charlie Brown, I was playing with defining the character so that I could bring these renderings into design meetings with my director. But I didn't want to end up drawing them too cartoony, so I eventually looked for more realistic drawing inspirations as I moved into final designs. I sourced images of children to get an idea of their physicality, but translated them onto adult bodies. In this case, I put those images onto their own layer to use as a reference while sketching out each body's pose. Then I could turn off that layer once I got the shapes blocked in. As mentioned in Procreate, you can draw in layers and manipulate the opacity of each of them, or just turn them off completely for a cleaner appearance. This idea of opacity and sheerness applies to the initial pencil sketch layers, as well as when putting in color. I tend to draw with a light opacity so that I can be really sketchy when laying down my initial thoughts. Think of it like using an HB pencil, and then moving to a 4B pencil once you start adding deeper lines and shadows. I wanted a sketchy feel to these renderings as a nod to their hand-drawn origination, so I left some of those foundational layers visible when adding color. There are so many media choices when working digitally, but I knew that I wanted vibrancy in this design, so I stuck with full opacity wall coloring. I also wanted to give a pencil-like texture when adding shadow, dimension, and color to give a sketchy quality to these renderings. So I color my work messily and then clean up with an eraser tool after the fact. This gives me a little freedom when applying color since I'm not worried about going outside the lines. For the Magic Flute, my goal was to play with texture while drawing. In these renderings, you can see a bit of the design process in that I start with grayscale sketches and then add color palettes in each upper corner, and notes with which to communicate intent to my director in those early design meetings. And then I only added color and backgrounds as these renderings became finalized. Because of the schedule, we fabric shopped before these got colored, so I used my mini palettes to guide me while shopping, and then added color to the renderings once I had the fabric. I don't always design in this order, but I love rendering when I already have the fabrics because that lends an extra layer of texture, detail, and clarity for me. Often when I render digitally, I like to unify a design with backgrounds, creating a template either with text or imagery onto which I can ground each character. I will usually use a background color that can replace skin tone, since at the point of rendering I don't have a cast, and I prefer not to make assumptions on my future actors' ethnicities. Hopefully as you see these renderings develop, you can see the inspiration pulled from my earlier sections on research, as well as the different tactilities achieved through incorporating the wool, feathers, leather, layers of sheer fabrics, and sparkles that were shopped with which to make these future garments. So as costumers, we have to do our costume renderings, and that show the character and emotion and intent behind the design. But sometimes those renderings lack a little bit of clarity or detail that will help the cutter draper do their job. Now, a good cutter draper can interpret the design and through conversation have you tell them what you want that design to look like. Where are the closures? What are the style lines? And they understand the history or the time periods you're working in. But often designers will provide technical drawings to their shop as well as the regular costume renderings. So similar to scenic design, when the technical director will break down the set and make construction draftings, often a designer or their assistant will break down a build so that the draper or first hands know what exactly the costume designer wants. And so technical drawings are part of the process, quick sketches that might have a little bit of research attached to them, specifically to show some of the intent behind the design. But this is where you can break down the garment for your draper and have them see where style lines are, what seams you're thinking about, what kind of finishing techniques you'd be interested in. And a lot of this can be solved through conversation. And just kind of chatting with each other. But when you're moving into a residency and people are starting their work ahead of you coming there, some designers don't get there to pull. The rest of the season starts and the designers come in afterwards. Technical drawings or those parts of the design packages will help the studio really plan for your builds, and they can get the drapings and the mock-ups done in a way that works with your design. So while you're rendering, the important thing to remember is after you've done your research and your sketches and your discussions is that you still have to find and produce all of these pieces. So a way to keep yourself organized is with a costume plot. So we've already talked about action plots or charts, and we've talked about the script notations, and those are based on your text. This next one is called a costume plot or an item list, depending. It might be a buy, pull, build, but really it's a breakdown of every single costume piece that you'll have to get for all of your actors, and it's based off of your renderings. So once you've finished your sketches, you will go through every single sketch and every single actor, and you will note down all the different pieces that they'll need, starting with the pieces that you can't see. So for example, with this character of Lucy, is that I knew that she was going to need little socks, some navy leggings, a navy hair bow, a blue dress, a blue nightgown, her black Mary Jane shoes, and then her 2D foam costume. When you're designing, knowing what kind of stock or location you're walking into can be helpful, because depending on the budgets of the company or on their availability, some companies have really good stocks and you can almost do any design out of there because you can pull and amalgamate and make things work and alter and adjust. And some companies or schools might not have a very extensive stock, either because they don't produce a lot of different types of plays. Some theaters only tend to produce modern dress, or they like to do Shakespeare's, or they like to do musicals. So there might be big pockets of things that are missing from their stock. And some places, unfortunately, don't have the luxury of storage, and they can't hold on to everything. Right? So we can't necessarily bank on certain things when we're designing. So learning as much as you can about that company, that school, that theater, and what their stock options are like will help you really plan with this document. Because as you can see, we have our item lists on that first section, and then notes as a way to keep yourself kind of updated with your own thoughts. Source means if you're going to pull, if you're going to shop it, or if you're going to build it. And oftentimes you've talked with your shop manager or with your costume director and you've negotiated how many builds are a part of your design package. Because sometimes no matter how hard you look, you just can't find the right thing for that actor in that moment with that garment. And things should be and have to be built. But depending on the company, they might not have the resources to provide you with people to build for you. So a lot of designers, when they start out, they design in a way that allows them to build it themselves, or they know what their resources are, or they have really good friends who help them, or whatever it is. But not often do you have the luxury of a full shop to support your design behind you. And then I added a column here as well called Sourced, which really was just to help me remember where I bought things from in case I ever have to go back and buy doubles or buy, multiples of that. In musicals, there's a lot of movement, a lot of dance. And so knowing if you don't have the budget to just buy two of some things, is to make sure you know where you can go back to get it in case something gets ripped. But there are certain garments that you just want to make sure you have multiples of, like tights and nylons, and have some backup shoes for certain sizes and people, because a lot of things could just explode during dress rehearsal week, depending on the quality of the garment and on the actor's movement. Some movement just makes it really hard for costumes not to get ripped. And that's just what happens. So as a costume plot, what's really important, this one's called a preliminary costume plot because it was purely based off of the renderings. And then as the production continues and you're hearing rehearsal information and you're getting rehearsal reports and you're talking to your actors, you might find that more things get added to it, or taken away, depending on if scenes get cut or moments don't necessarily need that change that you designed. And so what's important is I don't have a date on here, but normally when you're working, you would make sure that you have an update date section. So that way you know which version you're working from. And on any paperwork that you're working on, we'll discuss this a bit more in a later section about the different roles within the costume departments. But oftentimes as a designer, if you have an assistant, they're helping you with this paperwork. So it's pretty important to know which version that you're working from to make sure that you're literally both on the same page. And so keeping yourself updated to make sure that you're working from the right document. And so what a costume plot does, it's basically a checklist, because then you know if you're missing anything, you're literally putting things down on paper so that you don't drop any balls in the future. And this is also the document that you can send to wardrobe for when they start to make their own paperwork for all the backstage needs for the run of the show. And then you can see that we have Sally's costume pieces, and then Snoopy's costume pieces. Often for men, you might be offering them an undershirt, things that you can wash. Often in theater, especially in equity or union-based houses, we don't provide underwear to actors, they provide their own. And the expectation is that they will have neutral underwear, things that they can be comfortable in and wear on a daily basis. But undershirts, because often we can just throw those in the wash and they're really pretty easy to provide and they're not as fitted as shapewear, we will provide like A-line undershirts, tank top undershirts for men, or just undershirts. And for women, if they, especially in opera, if they like a base layer, like a onesie or a leotard or something that they can just wear to keep all of themselves in place while they're performing, we would provide that as well. So anything that makes their quick changes easier, as well as if the audience will see it. So for Linus, if I'm pre-shopping some of these, I might put the websites in on this as well so that I know, or in this case, since I have an Amazon account, I would just make a wish list for this production. And that's what I note, is that if it's on Amazon, if I have it on that wish list, then I already have it earmarked in that actor's size and color. And then you just monitor it, because it can be really heartbreaking if you've pre-shopped online and you go back to find it and it's been sold out. So then we have some information on Charlie. For Snoopy understudy, because in professional theater, we don't necessarily want to share costume pieces, I was providing a separate look for a second Snoopy. And so making sure that you have the budget that allows you to do your principal performers and then also your understudies, because ideally you can still pull from people's looks and people's pieces. It just makes cleanliness a little bit easier if you can just wash one person's full kit and not have to migrate pieces back and forth. So giving yourself notes of what you intend to do to those garments, how you hope to achieve it, it's really good to organize your thoughts so that way when you're talking to your shop manager or to your draper, you're able to kind of qualify what your needs are for your show. This was a pretty simple show when it comes down to the garments. We built 2 dresses and then we pulled a lot and we made these 2-dimensional foam pieces. And then people had accessories and details and things like that. So it was more of a craft-heavy show than a build show. But this was one of 5 productions that summer. And so when you're one of 5 in a one costume studio, you also have to weigh the needs of your production against the 4 other productions, and making sure that you're not pulling more resources than you should for a small show. So when a designer starts their residency or moves into the shop, they have all this preliminary paperwork and they have to have gone through stocks and started to pull. More often you'll send things ahead of time. You'll have shopped in the pre-season because you'll have gotten measurements. But ideally, you can hit the ground running when you join a shop. And so you're starting to acquaint yourself with their stock, you're going through their fabrics. You might have done a pre-shop somewhere else where they have more of a variety than your local area. Knowing where you're going to design is really helpful, and knowing what kind of availabilities are in that town. Does that place have just a couple of local garment and fabric stores? Do they have department stores? Do they deliver online easily? What is the accessibility of your costumes, and how can that fit into your budget? So a designer starts by pulling all of these pieces together and using their paperwork, their preliminary costume plot, as a way to figure out, are they pulling, are they buying, are they building, are they going online, are they shopping locally, are things returnable? Are things, once you buy them, then you're stuck with them? What are the policies of the stores, right? And so some departments might have a shopper or might have assistants that could help with that, which are also really cool jobs in that industry. But designers need to start to amalgamate all of the pieces that make up their design, because the big first thing to start are those fittings. And so depending on the company and if they prescribe to equity rules, you have limited time with your actors so that their work weeks don't explode with all the different things that they have to get into it. And so more often than not, you're allowed 3 one-hour fittings. Anything more than that, there might be special dispensation from the union, but that's usually what you can bank on as a professional costume designer. And depending where you are, they might not observe union rules. But usually there's that element of humanity, right? Is that you don't want to waste people's time. So you prepare for that fitting and you make sure that you have as much as you possibly can in order to outfit that actor in that look. And so for designing, what that means budget-wise or pulling-wise is we have all the actors' measurements, But are those measurements taken loosely? Are they taken really tight? Has the actor changed body shape a little bit since those measurements were taken? And so a good plan when you're prepping for fittings is to pull the things that you hope will work and plan to have work, but you also pull things that are a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger, things that can give you some variety when you're in the fittings. And then you or the shop manager could organize the rack in a way that allows for that first look to be fit, and you're hoping that it's the right one, or that there's alterability in that garment. It's always easier to make something a little bit big, smaller. It's not always possible to make a smaller item fit. It depends on what the seam allowances are like, or if you can add fabric or make things more comfortable. But ideally, you've measured all of your pieces to make sure that they'll work for that actor and for that body type and for their movement. Knowing what their character might be doing will be really helpful. Because fittings aren't necessarily about you. They're about your design, but you're also putting that design on an actor's body. And what's really important in fittings is that you are there to discuss the character. Someone's body or body type really shouldn't play any difference in a costume fitting. And more these days, we're having to acknowledge and wanting to acknowledge that it's about dressing the body for success and not necessarily trying to force a certain body type into a specific look. So now that you've taken your renderings off the page and onto a human shape, how can you still flatter that shape if that's the character? Or how do you not flatter the shape if that's the character, right? And fittings are about introducing these choices to the actor so the two of you can work together on it. Because you've been designing these characters for months now with the director, but the actor has also been doing their own work. And how can you start to marry these ideas together? Because they know their character very, very well, but you know the full show and how their character fits into the visual picture of that play. And how can you be cognizant of what they need, but also keeping the larger picture in mind? So fittings I find to be that balancing act, right? You're taking someone else's psychology and someone else's body and folding it in to how it works in your design as well. Throughout this design process, you're receiving rehearsal reports from stage management. And what these rehearsal reports will tell you are any questions that come from the rehearsal process, any requests for certain garments or types of garments, or things that the assistant stage managers are noting might impact costumes. It's really important to read these reports, or if you're assisting somebody, to scan them for any vital information, because it can be really awful to design a restrictive silhouette on a character. Like say you have them in a really slim pencil skirt, and you find out that they have to do a fan kick or the splits or something, right? So making sure that you're following that communication so that the design and the garments you have your actors in won't hinder their movement or their dancing or their abilities. So you're watching for how they're interacting with the set. You're watching for if they have to hide something on their person that might require a pocket, right? And these are all things that you can discuss with your actors in their fittings, but the rehearsal reports will really give you that information that might break down what to expect. Because professionally, designers don't necessarily get to sit in on rehearsal. It can be a luxury to be able to sit and observe and be a part of the rehearsal process. But in professional theater, you'll have what's called a designer run. So this is a rehearsal where all the performers are in the rehearsal space or on the stage if they have access to it, and they run through the entire show. So as designers, you get to see the blocking for the first time, you watch the dancing if it's a musical, and you're seeing how all of the play pieces are being put together. And so this happens just before tech rehearsal so that the lighting and scenic and props and sound designers can also see how things are going. And you can start to troubleshoot things before they happen. As a costume designer, I love sitting in designer run and I just visualize the different performers in their costumes to make sure that even though I've designed them all on the page, and I'll usually group characters together by scene to get an accurate idea of the stage picture, it's really fun to kind of just pop on their costumes and make sure that the color palettes that I have in mind are working, that the renderings that I've done have been translated well enough into the things I've pulled or built or bought, and that the colors and silhouettes and textures are still working all together as the play is progressing. So you guys remember the preliminary action plot that we had earlier on, and that was just from the text, and it just showed which characters were on stage at which point and for which spread of pages. But now that they've been in rehearsal, we have a bit more information. We know who's playing whom. We know what their costumes are and when they're wearing it. So this is broken up in a way that helped me track and explain to the actors or to stage management or to the director how I viewed costumes integrating into this story. So this first column here shows what everyone is wearing when, and then what they change and what they take on and off. And it also has that same information of entrances and exits so that we get an idea of how long they have. And then eventually, this paperwork will start to reflect when they enter and exit, what side of the stage do they do that on? If they exit on one side but enter on the other, they have to travel all that way and have a costume change, right? So making sure that you are tracking what the actors' movements are. Otherwise, if they have a 30 seconds to make a costume change, that can be really reasonable. But if it's 30 seconds and they have to run around the entire stage to get there, then they might not be able to make that same kind of change. So knowing the theatrical environment, what the layout and ground plan are like, and if there is easy access for actors to get from one side of the stage to the other without the audience seeing them. And all of that gets factored into your paperwork. And by this point, you're working a little bit with wardrobe. So then that way, they're the ones that are really kind of keeping this information in their heads and folding that paperwork together. But as a designer, the more clear you can be with how you want the work to go, the more it will help them. And so as a costume designer, I will always make sure to get as much as I can onto the action plots without being overwhelming. And so then they can see when the actor takes something off, when they put it on, and if that item is being struck or if that item is coming back again in another outfit. So in that way they know if they can take that garment piece and put it into a strike basket for laundry later, or if they have to then track that item around the stage. So the designer run is a good time to kind of double check yourself, and you have your paperwork to make sure that the entrances and exits and moments that you've anticipated are working the way that you think they are. Then as a costume designer, the next thing that would happen would be the tech rehearsals. Depending on where you are, some departments or companies will have costumes at tech and some won't. A lot of schools tend to fold costumes in at first dress, and depending on the summer company or the professional company, some of them might have them at tech and some of them might wait until first dress as well. It depends on the build schedule and what that company's tendencies or history with tech is. In professional shows, equity shows, often you will have costumes at tech, and that's a deadline for costumes just like every other department. Hamilton, for example, they tech in costume because the actors do all of the quick changes while they're also doing all of the scene changes. And so to practice your scene changes with not factoring in the clothing doesn't always give you an accurate idea of what your timing is like. So Hamilton techs in costume so that they can get used to all of the things together, and they tech for a long time. Depending on the professional company, they might have a couple of tech rehearsals and then a couple of dress rehearsals, and it breaks down to what the schedule can be and how much you can fold in at a given time. Utah Festival Opera and Musical Theater is a repertory company, so we produce 5 to 6 shows in a given summer in that 13-week build period before opening night. And so we actually only add costumes at first dress rehearsal. But knowing what that company's expectations are will help you plan accordingly as you're going through your design process. So for us, we put our costumes in at first dress. And in opera, that can also be called piano dress because the performers are singing in costume and wigs and makeup, but only a piano, not with orchestra. And so it gives costumes a chance to troubleshoot any issues. Ideally, you've had fittings with all of your actors so you know how things fit and what to expect, and if there are any quick changes. And by now you've been working with your wardrobe supervisor, and they've been preparing all the necessary paperwork to make their job go fluidly backstage. And they've taken your costume plot and your action plot and information from stage management, and they've built that paperwork to prep the crew with. So ideally, as a costume designer, your first dress is seeing everything assembled on stage together. It's the first time you're seeing your costumes under lights, you're seeing the actors on stage, and you're getting to watch how your costumes are helping that story unfold. But first dress can also be the time when you're trying to fix any things that got missed or any mistakes, or you're refining the process. So things got designed in a certain way, but now with more input from your management, from actors, or from whomever, from the director, things might adjust, and that's okay. Dress rehearsal is that time to refine these processes. And so first dress rehearsal will happen, and that's your piano dress. And then afterwards, the actors will perform kind of a standing rehearsal called a Sitzprobe, where they'll learn to work with the orchestra. And so they'll do an orchestra rehearsal, and then second dress rehearsal is also called orchestra dress for that reason. It's the first time that the actors and the orchestra are all working together in the same space. And then third dress rehearsal for some places might also be called preview. And preview is where we invite the audience and we fold in that last component for live theater. And so a preview, depending on where you are, might be a performance or a few performances or even a couple of weeks of performances. But these are still technically rehearsals, even if they have a live audience. And it's a way to learn the rhythm of the show and see if things are paying off. But it's still a time to refine all of the choices being made until opening night. So as a costume designer, often our job is finished on opening night because we have to let that costume design go, and it's now in the hands of wardrobe and the actors. And so wardrobe will take over and they'll become your eyes backstage and the ones that maintain your design after you have to leave. So working on those relationships with wardrobe and making sure that you've given them all the tools that they need so that they can keep on working is a really important way to maintain the success of a design. I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope that this proved a helpful introduction to the world of costume design. Hello and welcome to this video in which we'll discuss the different areas found within the costuming department. And so the costume designer will make all of the designs, and then there are a lot of people who bring that work forward, and we'll discuss those different roles today. So coming up, I'll talk you through a lot of the different roles that can be found within a costume shop, but just know that these roles vary, right? Theater is made by people, so sometimes the terminology will shift depending on the company, or sometimes the roles, specific people, will be kind of collapsed down to one person. So I'll give you the terminology, but just know that not every costume shop will have all of these different people, and one person might serve a few different hats depending on what the budget and the size and the abilities of that company are. So as we discussed in the earlier video about costume design, is that the costume designer conceptualizes the show. They take the text, they do the research, they create the characters, and they render the entire production. An associate designer is someone that works very closely to the costume designer. And they're someone that understands that designer's aesthetic and is able to make informed choices because they understand kind of the world in which that designer is trying to live with that design. And so an associate designer is just below the costume designer and knows them well enough to be able to make decisions on their behalf if the costume designer is in a fitting or in a rehearsal or otherwise indisposed at that moment. An assistant costume designer is someone that assists. They learn that costume designer, they figure out what they need, and they help them in a few different facets. So they might be someone that knows that that designer gets hangry and needs a granola bar in their purse, right? Or they might be someone that knows how that designer likes their paperwork to be done and will do it exactly like that. So an assistant designer helps keep all of the organization going. They are usually the steward of all the paperwork. And so like we talked about in that first video with the costume plot and the action chart, that's paperwork that the assistant would really keep updated and make sure that as they go through fittings or as they get information from the rehearsal reports, that they are updating that work for the costume designer. And often the assistant will be present in fittings to help take notes or hand things off to the different people running the fittings. Depending on the company, an assistant designer might be an intern and might be someone who's there to also learn the process. But that's a different thing depending on the company. A professional assistant designer is someone who helps push the design forward and really works to make the designer their best self and do their best work. So that's kind of the cadre of the design team. But in costuming, we have costume design and costume technology. And costume technology refers to everyone who builds, basically. If you're a costume technologist, you might have design abilities, but you are focusing on the execution of the costume design. You're making it tangible, you're putting it into fabric and making it three-dimensional. And so the person who does that in a costume shop is called the cutter draper, or draper for short. And a cutter draper is the person that takes the renderings from the designer and makes them into the patterns. And they either do that through flat patterning, where you take the actor's measurements and the style lines from the renderings, and you plot it out on paper. You draft it out flat, and that's how you make your pattern pieces. Draping is when you work in three-dimensional and you drape fabric on a form to achieve that look. So some cutter drapers will use both techniques. Some will be more math-based and some will be more 3D kind of volume-based. But they're both very wonderful ways of working. It just depends on how your mind can sculpt in space. Does it sculpt 3D and have it be a visual thing in front of you? Or does it sculpt flat and then you can take it and make it into a three-dimensional garment? But the cutter draper is the translator of the design rendering to the design on how it sits on the actor's body. The cutter draper will usually work over top of the shop, but have you ever been in a situation where you're the only one who has the answer and everyone's asking you questions? Do you ever get work done when that happens? And the answer is probably no, right? Often in costume shops or in a lot of shops, it's built in a hierarchy in order to make sure that more people have the right information and not everyone is going to one person. Not everyone asks the questions of just the designer or just the cutter draper. And that's where first hands come in. So a first hand is basically an assistant to the cutter draper, but they assist in a very different way than an assistant designer does. A first hand works with the cutter draper to make those patterns a reality. So depending on the first hand's capabilities, they will oversee their stitchers and oversee the shop and make sure that notes and alterations and builds are happening at a right manner. Or they'll take the patterns that the draper has made and they'll actually cut them out of the fabric. And in that case, they're taking into consideration what is the directionality of the fabric, what's the pattern, are you matching that pattern? Are you intentionally going against it? What's the grain line of that fabric? Do you have enough of it? They might also self-inform on some of those really complex alterations that come out of fittings. Depending on the production, there might be a lot of magic happening in the costumes because of quick changes. And so what is that structural change that has to happen to the garment? And the first hand will usually know how to do that so that they can talk the stitchers through. And so the first hand is kind of the funnel from the shop up to the cutter draper, so that the cutter draper can still answer questions and be available, but they don't have to answer every question. Because depending on the skill level of your stitchers, some of those questions will be very complex, and some of them will be very simple. And so the first hands kind of act as a buffer and help keep work moving through people's hands. So right underneath the first hands are your stitchers. And depending on your company, you might have some varying levels to how those stitchers are. Some companies might have a master stitcher. And this is a person who has done so much sewing that they just know all the different time periods and techniques. If you ask them to do something, they know what you mean and can just do it. They don't need to be talked through something. So a master stitcher is a very experienced stitcher and can kind of just execute and get work done in the shop. But a lot of stitchers have experience, but they might not have stitched on everything, right? Depending on the time period, there are different techniques that are needed. There's understructures that might need to have information on. There's techniques or materials that they might not have worked with or they might be very proficient in. And there might be fabrics that are a little bit more difficult. So depending on the type of sewing they've done in the past, a stitcher really has to engage with a lot of different types of fabrics. Someone who sews a lot but has never built a corset will have a lot of learning to do because of the structures and layers and boning that goes into a corset. And if you've somehow managed to live your life and never worked on the production of cats, is that maybe you've never sewn spandex and never sewn tight garment, stretchy fabrics. That's a whole other skill set. So stitchers, to be a good stitcher, you have to have experience and be proficient in the different types of fabrics you might encounter, but also what are the different sewing techniques, hand, machine, fabric manipulation, the different things that will add texture and variety to costumes. So people who are interested in stitching, it's really about doing as much as you can, making commercial garments to see how those are interpreted, making your own to see how they turn out, learning different ways to finish seams. Are you working with a plain seam? Are you serging the edges of your fabric to keep it from unraveling? Are you pinking? Will that last through 8 shows a week of laundry? Are you French seaming? How are you putting that garment together? How do you put zippers in? What's the directionality of the lap for that placket? And how do you make things secure but also invisible? So a lot of those terms I just mentioned will be told to stitchers by the first hands or draper or designer. And a lot of those decisions get made higher up because that's part of the aesthetic of the garment. But a good stitcher is able to execute those same techniques in a way that suits the character and can work with the fabric. And so you have to be a little bit of a MacGyver sometimes when it comes to being a stitcher, is minding what you're doing, watching how it's going, and monitoring your own progress to make sure that you're doing it in a way that will look good on stage, but also be comfortable and good for your actor. So that's the main bulk of a costume studio, are the people on the technology side who are making those different roles happen. But there's a whole other department as well that I want to talk to you guys about, and that's crafts. So crafts is basically all the accessories. Depending on the company, crafts can really fluctuate depending on what the skills are and what the experience is and what the stock is like. But crafts basically covers all the accessories or decorations. So to be a successful craft artisan or to learn as much as you can about crafting, it's not just about being a proficient stitcher, because that helps. Knowing how to sew well by hand and by machine is very beneficial, but it's also about the different materials. As a craft artisan, you will work more likely with things like thermoplastics, things that melt and shape and that you can form new techniques with. Leather, metal, you might have to do a lot of wire working. You might need to make a puppet, depending on the production. You might need to paint or fix shoes and learn how to work with dance rubber. Craft artisans also build or repair jewelry. And they do a lot of painting, depending on the aesthetic and needs of a show. So whereas a stitcher will work predominantly with fabric, a craft artisan has to learn kind of all the little bits and pieces that they can use to sell those layers of a design. So a craft artisan can really add detail in that designer's aesthetic to their piece. And every show is kind of an excuse to learn a new skill. Craft artisans also usually have to do the distressing, unless the designer is really excited about it. But distressing is when you ruin a garment. You make it look old, you make it look worn, especially if the design of the show needs things to look more lived in. And so distressing is when you achieve that through abrasion, through paint, through dye, or through temporary means. Not everything can be distressed permanently, especially if it's a rented or a borrowed garment. You can't just paint it and dye it. That's the fastest way to get the stains that you want. You can't use a rasp or a file and mess up the fibers and rough them up. And so you also have to investigate what are temporary techniques that will make this garment look rough, but not actually compromise the integrity of the garment. And so exploring techniques of layering filth on top, be it through fabric or be it through threads and things like that. Or if it's a type of paint that comes out with dry cleaning, right? So really informing on what different products can do and how they'll help you get to that level of distressing or decoration that you're going for. So an element of crafting is painting and dyeing. But depending on the company, they might actually have a painter-dyer. So there are jobs out there where if you are someone who is more textile-based and you know color and you know dye, a painter-dyer could be your position. And so a painter-dyer needs to know fabric. Fabric has synthetic and natural styles, right? You have your cottons and silks and linens and wools, your natural fibers that come from plants or from animals. And then you have your synthetic. You have your plastic-based garments, your polyesters, your nylons, your lycras, your stretch. And knowing how synthetics and natural fibers will take paint and dye is really important, so that you know that as you're changing the chemical makeup of that garment, that it's going to stay put when you wash it. So at the end of the day, costumes get worn. Costumes that get worn get washed. And if your work can't survive laundry, it's not going to survive the show. So a good painter dyer knows fibers in a way that allows them to achieve the look they want for the length of time they want. And so learning as much as you can about those techniques and what different products will do on natural versus synthetic fibers is really beneficial as a painter dyer. Another subset of craft is a milliner. So a milliner is specifically a hat maker. And so painting and dyeing and millinery are skills that are helpful for craft artisans. But depending on the theater or the company, they might have a milliner. That's all they do is build the hats or the headwear. And so a milliner works really closely with the wig department to make sure that the hats that they're working on for that design will still live on the wigs or the natural hair of those performers. And so for millinery, knowing different techniques of working with buckram, which is kind of a heat-sensitive, water-sensitive product that can be shaped or wired to create a hat. You need to know straw, right? How do straw hats get created and crafted together? Working with wool. Wool as a fiber isn't woven. Wool is felted together. So it gets agitated, little small fibers of wool, gets agitated with heat and with pressure and becomes this matted piece of fabric. And so what that means is that wool, felt, doesn't have a grain line, doesn't have a direction. So you can stretch it with heat and with steam to make it into something. And so wool hats are really nice for close-fitting hats that fit around the head, but you can shape them to an actor's head size over their wig, or to get the shape you want. But that's a whole different type of techniques. It's not about sewing, it's about applying pressure and steam to create something through stretching. And then milliners also need to know things about how to attach hats to wigs or to hair to have them stay nice and supported and not slide off the actor's head. And the different time periods and styles of hats that are very specific to those shows. And so you can see that as a costumer, knowing a little bit about all of these is a nice way to introduce yourself to the costume industry, right? All the people that build and make those designs a reality. But all those people wouldn't necessarily be organized if we didn't have another layer of the costume shop, and that's the costume management section. So as the director of costumes at Utah Festival Opera, I have a certain set of skills and things to oversee, and I kind of monitor the different departments. But more companies than not have what's called the costume studio supervisor. And that's the person that does the hiring, that does the organization of the schedule, that negotiates with the designers who's having how many builds and what they're building and what their budgets are. And so the costume studio supervisor really is the organization of the costume shop. They're the stage manager of the costume department. And so the supervisor at UFOMT, we kind of share some of those duties, but the supervisor also oversees all of the fittings. So some companies will have a costume studio supervisor, and they do all the things that I just talked about. And they're really about maintaining momentum of the workflow through the costume shop and watching how people are doing. Are there things that they need help with? Are they unclear on some of the techniques? How can we give workshops or make sure that people know how to do these different techniques that we're having them do? And they're really about minding morale and productivity. And if that company also has a costume studio foreman, they're the person that's on the floor checking in directly with all the stitchers, answering questions, and kind of keeping things from stalling out if someone needs clarification on their next step. So the director, the supervisor, and the foreman might all share some of those same roles depending on what kind of company you're working at. But a foreman is someone who assists in the organization and the productivity of the shop underneath the costume shop supervisor. And so you can see that we have these kind of two trains, right, going through a costume shop. You have the design and the execution, but then also the people who are helping to keep things organized. So the management team will make sure that fittings are happening, that the designers are getting the actors they need for those fittings. But we're also calling people when we're ready for them and that we have the pieces ready. So they're communicating with the designer, with the assistants, with the first hands and the draper to make sure that if we call this actor, we're going to have all the pieces we need for them and we're not going to surprise anybody, right? So a good costume shop will have that collaboration between the different roles to make sure that there's no time burglary, especially in a short summer stock build period, is that you want to make sure that you're not calling actors for before you actually have the pieces ready to try on them. And so the shop management team really keeps that organization going. The last section of the costume department that I want to talk about is wardrobe. And so wardrobe takes all of the information from the design and they put it into the wardrobe tracking paperwork and training of the wardrobe crew for the actual production. So often you'll have a wardrobe supervisor who interfaces directly with the designer, the costume designer, and with the stage manager of that production. And they take the paperwork from both of those teams and they meld it into the wardrobe tracking paperwork. Different industries use wardrobe supervisors differently. In opera, stage management will make the wardrobe tracking paperwork because they're in rehearsals and they're communicating directly with the designer to do so. In theater and in musical theater, the wardrobe supervisor builds the paperwork with the input from stage management and from the designer. So depending on where you go as a wardrobe supervisor is making sure you understand what the makeup of that company is and what will be required of you as a wardrobe supervisor. And so as mentioned, I'm going to pull up my screen again. In a prior video, we talked about the costume plot, right? So the costume plot is that long list of every single thing that an actor is wearing. So this is an example of Your Good Man Charlie Brown's costume plot from 2018. And it's divided by character with the actor's name, what scene, musical number, or page that garment is being worn in, what those costume pieces are, what their source is from. Did it come from your own stock? Was it purchased? Was it built? Or was it pulled from other institutions? This is helpful to know because either you know what has to go back into your stock at strike, or what has to be earmarked for return to other rental companies once it's done being dry cleaned or cleaned. Mode can refer to its maintenance and how it can be washed or maintained during the run of the show. Not everything is machine washable and dryable, and so noting when things are done for wardrobes, then that way they can plan for their laundry schedule. So if things are machine wash or machine dryable, if they need to be sprayed with fabric refresher, or if they're just to be sanitized throughout the run before they get restocked. And then notes is a way to indicate to the wardrobe team from the design team what are some things that they might need to know during the run of the show. And then wardrobe takes this information and they make it into their wardrobe tracking paperwork. Now, wardrobe tracking paperwork can take an assortment of different styles or looks. The important thing is that it breaks down all of the items worn by the actors, when they wear it, and how wardrobe has to get it to them. Are they changing in the dressing rooms? Are they changing side stage left, or stage right? Are the garments being preset somewhere so actors can get them very quickly during the show? And so wardrobe's job is taking all of the costume pieces and making sure that they're accounted for and planned for, letting the actors know where they can expect those garments to be for certain times. Some changes are leisurely, and an actor can go down to their dressing room and get changed at their own pace. But some costume changes, quick changes, have to happen on deck. They have to happen just backstage, and they happen quickly, and wardrobe works with them to achieve that change. So these tracking paperworks act as a checklist for wardrobe to make sure that they have everything ready and in the proper place. A good trick when changing an actor is making sure that you have their costumes on the side of the stage by which they're entering. If an actor has to exit on stage right but enter on stage left, it's always easier to have them be right where they need to have their entrance while they're doing the change. That way, if something does go wrong, at least they're right there, and they can go on stage as fast as possible. If they exit the space and then change and then still have to travel to the other side of the stage, that can make for a very stressful situation. So wardrobe tracking paperwork gives the wardrobe team an idea on how to plan for the changes within a show. This example is broken down to stage left and stage right changes. And so you can see here that it's organized by the top of show and saying what has to be preset where. So in this case, Charlie, his sneakers were being preset on stage under the table. And then during scene 1 opening, these are what the actors are wearing and what wardrobe is doing once they have to take off a piece of their costume. So it notes not just what you're giving to actors, but also when they take things off and they have to hand off those garments backstage. And so it's broken down by song or by scene. And in some moments, there might not be anything for wardrobe to do, but you always want to track the action so that you know as a wardrober where you are in the action of the play. So earlier we just looked at wardrobe tracking paperwork, which is the blueprint for all of the wardrobe action that has to happen backstage. During the pre-show, wardrobe has to prep all of the things for the actors. And this could mean maintenance, making sure that things are ironed or pressed that are supposed to be, that things might be wrinkled that are supposed to be, making sure that all closures are still functional and that things are working out. One of the ways they do that during the pre-show, before the actors arrive, is with check-in and out sheets. It's very important that wardrobe knows that everything for the actors is accounted for and ready to go. So this is an example again from Charlie Brown, where wardrobe has taken all the items off of that costume plot and created a list that had every single date that that show was happening. And so those garments would be checked out at the very beginning. So then that way we know that they're all counted for. And then they're checked back in at the end of the night. And we've made sure that nothing is going missing. With check-in and out sheets, this is also a way that you could put a glossary on there for laundry or for maintenance. But the most important thing with check-in sheets is that you are putting your hands on every single garment piece and making sure that it's ready. So then that way, in the speed of a quick change, isn't when you realize that something's gone missing. And this is another example of paperwork that wardrobe supervising team will take from the costume designer and their team in order to make their own. So making sure that as a costume designer, your paperwork is updated really helps the next person do their job. Because a wardrobe supervisor, when they have a wardrobe crew, part of their job is to break down all the different tasks that have to happen and assign them to various wardrobe crew members. So then that way, the wardrobe supervisor knows the big picture, but that the crew can focus on their actors or their area or however it breaks down. And so for wardrobe supervision, when the designer leaves after opening night, you are the steward of the costume design. Your job is to make sure that what happens on opening night is the same look that happens by the time that performance closes. So you're the quality control manager. And in their own ways, the wardrobe crews are as well, is that you're making sure that the decisions that were made and agreed upon stay accurate throughout the rest of the production. Because wardrobe facilitates all the changes for the actors, and then also maintains the integrity of design and does all the laundry. And so there are certain things that need to be washed every single performance. If you guys learn about Actors Equity, the performance union in theater for stage managers and actors, Actors Equity has some very specific rules about cleanliness, which makes sense, right? Is that every actor gets a clean skin layer for every production. And a skin layer are the pieces that touch your body. So if they're nylons, if they're undershirts, if they're wearing a body shaper, you have to give a clean version for every performance. And so laundry has to be done in order to get those ready for the next production. Or you also have garments that can be washed on regularly. We wash a lot of things on cold so that you don't get bleeding colors. But laundry has to be done so that, especially with musicals where there's a lot of movement and sweat, that the actors can have clean and comfortable things to wear. But what do you do when you can't clean everything and it's only dry clean only? So wardrobe does what's called a fabric refresher. So I'm sure you've all heard of Febreze. Hot tip, theater Febreze is actually vodka, because really cheap vodka is cheaper than Febreze, and you don't have the smell that's associated with Febreze, because believe it or not, some actors actually might have an allergy to some of those chemical products. But as an alcohol that evaporates, when it does, vodka pulls the scent out of the garments, and that can be a way to maintain your garments between dry cleanings. If you have a really long run of a show, you might dry clean at the midway point. But if you have a shorter run, more often than not, you will use your vodka spray or your fabric spray every night to make sure that garments are maintained fresh, and then you'll wash what you can wash throughout the run of the show. But a tip to kids who are interested in acting, you will always be enamored from your wardrobe crew if you hang things up properly. If you hang one thing per hanger, that allows us to access everything with our spray bottles. And if you don't leave things on a pile on the floor. Wardrobe has a lot to do at the end of the night when your job is done as performers, and that it'll always behoove you to help hang those things up appropriately or put them in their laundry baskets if that's a part of the culture of that theater. So as an actor, asking yourself, what does my theater need me to do? And then doing it will make your wardrobe people really happy and really helpful, especially since they have a lot to do at the end of the night already. So the wardrobe supervisor has made this paperwork to plan out who's getting changed when and by whom. They're making laundry schedules to talk about when we are cleaning or spraying or working with these garments. They're maintaining repairs. When zippers bust out or snaps fly off, wardrobe is looking over all of the garments and making sure that they can happen. But there's also the element of wardrobe is that you're working closely with the actors and you want to make sure that they have the things they need to be successful that night. And so there's an element of wardrobe that's psychology-based, where you're observing and learning and being a support network for someone who's, when your job is done as a quick change wardrober, their job is just starting. And how can you make sure that you're giving them what they need to go on stage and to be successful? And wardrobe does all of that. 8 shows a week for the duration of the production. Within all areas of costumes, there's usually internships available. Now, internships can be in the design area, the technology area, wardrobe, crafts, wherever it is, with the understanding that interns are there to do the job, but also learn the job. Theater is an apprentice-based art form, so you learn from doing it and learn from the people that you're doing it with. And so as interns, is the understanding that you are there to learn how to do that company's version of theater. And understanding that just because you're learning away at your school or at that community theater or at that company, it might vary at the next job that you go to. And that's part of the goal of internships, is learning the different techniques and skill sets that will help you in the theater industry. And not that one way is better or worse than the other, but as an intern, you're there to learn them and then either choose to add them to your toolbox of skills or put them aside if they don't necessarily suit your working style. So thank you for joining me. I hope this was helpful in talking to you about the different facets of the costuming industry. Thanks so much.